Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm really delighted to welcome you to the launch of Don't Call It a Cult, the shocking story of Keith Raniere and the Women of NXIVM, with author Sarah Berman and journalist Amil Niazi. My name is Zoe Grams, and I, along with my partner Ian Gill, am a co-founder of Upstart Crow Literary Arts Studio. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited settler on these lands and that this event and this space is on the unceded and traditional territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm going to say a few quick words for some housekeeping here before I hand it over to Sarah and Amil. First of all, big thanks to our event tech, Ariel Hudnall, who's behind the scenes. We're really hoping for smooth sailing tonight, but if for whatever reason we need to take a break, it will be Ariel, who you'll see in the chat, and Ariel, whose voice you might hear. Of course, we are here to support Sarah in addition to finding out more about this really incredible work. And so please, if you can, buy the book. If you've already purchased it through Upstart and Crow, thank you. The official publication date is this Tuesday, April 20th. But you can pick up the book from us as of today if you've already purchased it. If you haven't, you're welcome to come down to Granville Island and do so, or you can email us and we will put the email address in the chat. I know there's quite a few people tuning in from across Canada and even in the US, and so I'd also really encourage you to support your local independent bookstore, wherever that might be. In terms of the event that will be and how we're going to run it this evening, I'm going to get off your screens fairly quickly, as I mentioned, and then you'll see Sarah and Amil. They're going to chat for about 30 minutes, after which time there will be a Q&A. If you do have any questions for Sarah, please put them in the YouTube chat throughout the event, and we'll be sharing them with Sarah and Amil for that portion of the evening. And so before I hand it over, I'd love to introduce these two incredible writers and thinkers. A little bit about the book first. I think Scaachi Koul, the best-selling author of One Day We'll All Be Dead, perhaps said it best, that Don't Call It a Cult is the most detailed, well-reported, and nuanced look at NXIVM's history, its supporters, and those left destroyed in its wake. If you want to understand NXIVM and other groups like it, reading Sarah Berman's account is essential. We agree. And the author, Sarah Berman, as many of you know, and who I had the pleasure of working with when she was at Vice. Sarah is an investigative journalist based in Vancouver. And as a senior editor and reporter with Vice, she's covered a number of controlling and coercive groups, including a reporting trip to a polygamous Mormon colony in Bountiful, BC in December 2016. Since 2017, she has followed the story of NXIVM and its leaders and enforcers faced criminal investigation and trial. Her reporting has appeared in Maclean's, Reuters, the Globe and Mail, and the Vancouver Sun. And interviewing her is Amil Niazi, an award-winning writer and producer who has worked with the BBC, The Guardian, Vice, and CBC. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Washington Post, and The Guardian. And with that, I will hand it over to them.
Thanks, Zoe.
Hey, yeah, thanks for that intro. Good to see you, Amil.
Good to see you, Sarah. It's so nice to do this with you. And congratulations on this book. I was lucky enough to be at Vice when you first started reporting this story, which is crazy because that was like 5 years ago. So long ago. So take me back to when you first got wind of this group and of Keith and kind of where that story was 5 years ago.
Right. So I learned about the branding, the skin branding, and sort of scary sex cult stuff of NXIVM the same way a lot of people did through the New York Times. They had a story in October 2017. And I noticed that there was connections to Vancouver. And in fact, through Facebook, I noticed that there was a lot of connections through friends of friends. You know, I had friends who went to high school with Nicki Clyne, for example. And so that was one flag that I really, wanted to solve early on. Like, how could people that I know who seem to be in my sort of cohort of people be connected to something like this in the New York Times that includes, some pretty dark stuff. So that was my entry point. I did start to realize that those connections actually went back a lot further, that I had friends, going back to 2012, 2013, who were also involved and just described it as bizarro landmark or whatever.
Yeah.
So
which landmark for people is like a kind of like a self-help pyramid scheme, I want to say.
I would say it's definitely lighter than NXIVM. Their weekend seminars, usually leadership training is how it's described. Most people don't come out of that too hurt, but there is sort of an inner circle there as well in California. But my first meeting with Sarah Edmondson was truly what turned everything upside down for me. Just speaking to her and hearing her true fear of this group. That set me down this sort of path of trying to figure out how someone could come to something, wanting a better life, wanting to level up in their career, in their relationship, and then somehow it being twisted to this upside down sort of scenario where they're coerced, they're, doing unspeakable things, and they don't feel like they have a choice. So that was the beginning. In the beginning, I also had a lot of folks reaching out to me and saying, oh yeah, somebody pitched me, in a ride home, or I took a yoga class with Kristen Crook, what have you, all these sort of cameos through Vancouver. But that quieted down, I would say, around the time that Keith Raniere was arrested in 2018. People lawyered up, people got pretty quiet, and that was kind of scary as a journalist to have people kind of drop off like that. But once the trial got going, once you sort of heard from everybody, I think, that sort of got the story moving again.
Yeah. And was it that conversation with Sarah when you realized like the breadth and the scope of this story?
I don't think I did fully clock it at that time. I don't think it's possible to clock the story in just sort of one hour and a half interview. Definitely in terms of their abuse of the legal system, and they're sending private investigators after people, and even filing charges against people in other countries. These were things that came to me slowly. So the bottom fell out so many different times. And I sort of had to always rethink and come back to, okay, do I understand what's happening? Can I explain it to somebody else? That's an even higher bar to hit. So I think it's even today still developing, still learning. But I think it's come to a point where, we can lay it out in a way that hopefully people can decide for themselves what they think is going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've done that really well. Well, given that the story is still happening, it's still so fascinating because it's still ongoing. At what point were you like, okay, I have to call it, like the book is going to encompass this part of the story, and then, you just let the rest play out? Because I imagine with something like this where all the parts are moving so quickly, that would be so daunting.
Yeah, so even after the trial was finished, that was like 2019, I still didn't feel like I could end it. It still felt so up in the air. I still felt like even Keith Raniere could appeal. He's got some pretty expensive lawyers working on his case. This could go in any kind of direction. But after the sentencing in October 2020, and you heard from so many more of the women, so you heard from, for example, a woman identified in court as Camilla. She spoke, and she was sexually exploited as a 15-year-old. And that really sort of started to close it all together and really, I think got me to a point where I was like, okay, he's probably going to appeal, but we're in 120 years in jail territory. I think we can call it for now.
Mm-hmm. God, 120 years is a long time.
Long time.
You make a deliberate choice, and it's right in the title. Don't call it a cult, but you also avoid labeling it. Some of the more salacious things that people have labeled it, a sex cult. Why that choice?
Yeah, so I mean, lots of my reporting was headlined with sex cult, and I do understand that as a shorthand. People understand it, but I think people come to this with very different levels of understanding of what a cult is and what a sex cult might be. Some people might think you join a sex cult for sex, or that these women
fair enough.
were coming to it wanting to be part of something that could be termed a sex cult. And that's absolutely just not the case. Nobody joined a cult. Nobody joined a sex cult when they started. They wanted to level up their relationships and their personal lives and their careers. So I think what I wanted to do was front load describing the coercion, describing the harm, and describing sort of the elements that can make something a cult. Certainly experts in this case are saying, yes, it ticks all the boxes. It's a cult, and it was used in addition to getting sex to also get all kinds of power and control over these people's lives. So they didn't have autonomy in all kinds of other areas of their life as well. So yeah, describing that first before people can delve into this concept of what a cult or what a sex cult is was important to me, because I just didn't want people thinking I was drawing that conclusion for them. But hopefully by the end, they'll sort of figure out where they stand on that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, it's one of those stories where the salacious details are never ending. And obviously both of the documentaries, the HBO and the Stars one, sort of trade heavily on that. What do you think people may have missed that they'll get from your book, getting caught up in all that sort of, scandalized sex and branding and, little impish Keith Raniere luring all these beautiful actresses? What do you hope that people can take away from the book that they missed in some of those more salacious treatments?
I do hope they come away with it, like understanding more of what was legal and what was illegal. So it is focused on the women who spoke in court. You definitely hear their stories more in depth, I think, than any of the reporting. Definitely for Daniela and Camilla and Nicole, three of the women who only spoke in court. They didn't speak to any of the podcasts or documentaries. Hearing from them is so important, because that's what made this case. And that's what truly made it a hard to believe, because at the outset, people weren't sure if this trafficking thing really applied. And I think getting people to understand how that fit together and how these women got, from point A to point B, all these little steps into that sort of led to the center of this group is so important. Because again, the breaking stories, they can't get into those really minute details that got people there. If you stay with just the end point where people are, hurting each other, they're getting their skin burned, and there's a lot going on that seems really unbelievable. You leave out all those sort of midpoints that are just really crucial in terms of building their credibility, even as people. So yeah, I did want to fill in those gaps.
And you did that really well. The first time you see Keith in the documentaries, you're sort of like, this guy, really? What, having spent so much time with this story and the nuance and the intricacy. What is it about this guy?
Great question. Because yeah, I definitely watched all these videos and I was like, come on, this is not genius philosopher material. Like this
No.
guy, he can barely string a sentence together. I was kind of upset. And I do think his charisma was engineered. I think he had a group of women building him up, pumping his tires, as Sarah Edmondson would say. Basically just making sure that the mythology of Keith Raniere as this genius who, filed all these patents and broke all these incredible barriers was just at the top of people's minds way before they ever met him. So I think that was a huge part of it. And it's surprising because you don't think, okay, if 5 people told me someone's great, like I think I would stick to my own assessment, but we are truly, suggestible in these ways. And if you can engineer it, because we don't think that's engineered, we're not going to assume 5 people telling us someone's great is like an instruction or an order. That's a really conspiratorial place to live.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to believe it. Like we have these believing kind of tendencies. So I truly came to the conclusion that very little of it came from Keith himself. He definitely had people working at like very hard, very committed to pumping him up as this genius philosopher.
You talked a bit about, people wanting to improve their lives, better their careers. There's so much banality in the actual day-to-day of NXIVM as a group. So what was the lure? How did people get drawn into this group?
Yeah, it's so fascinating because I think they would be convinced very early on in the courses themselves that there was just nothing else that they should be putting their effort towards. That, the only way that you can sort of change the world, make the world better, is to address these quote unquote disintegrations. So sort of their idea of a psychological imbalance. And as long as these psychological imbalances are everywhere, everything's gonna always fall apart. And so once you're on board with this idea that no matter what, psychological imbalances have to come first, then everything, even the most minute, like washing a refrigerator, becomes some sort of epic mission to save the world. So unfortunately, people couldn't really take this bigger picture view and be like, wait a second, I'm doing nothing here. Like I'm literally not doing anything,
Mm-hmm.
because they were so dialed into this sort of mythology that, again, was frankly like military grade re-education.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't fault them for sort of having these beliefs, after going through what is really regimented, like thought reform, essentially. So yeah, it didn't make sense for me for a really long time. I would ask Sarah Edmondson, like, how is this helping? Like, how did you ever think this was changing the world or even making someone a better person? And I think, yeah, it just, after that much exposure and conditioning, it clicked. That was the first thought.
I mean, I'll admit that there were moments when I was like, I mean, this kind of makes sense. Like I could see how in the desire for like we're so obsessed with hacking our way into a better version of ourselves and being the best worker, or, utilizing our ambition and our skills to do whatever further the capitalist machine, that there were moments where I was like, okay, like it's not that crazy. Were you ever like, okay, I kind of get it?
I was worried for myself because, yeah, I have fallen into productivity mindset in the past. It has hurt me in various ways. Like, I'm thankful that now I've sort of backed off that. But yeah, I think it is enticing. I think everybody does want to multitask, be the best that they can, and sort of put their best foot forward in whatever way they can. And that's the thing, is that's any kind of successful high control group is going to have something that does make sense. Like, there's a shred of truth, just a tiny thread of it, or something relatable that does keep people coming back. And yeah, unfortunately, our capitalist sort of hellscape really gets people in the mindset where they need something. They need some shortcut. They need some quick fix that will get them, to the place that they want to be. And yeah, NXIVM really lived in that sort of lie and misdirection. Like, yes, this is your shortcut. This is going to get you there. And it frankly just did it for almost nobody, like almost nobody.
Yeah. So it just they didn't do anything.
I would say people had beautiful relationships in this group. I would say that, yeah, people helped each other. So if someone who was really committed and, like, for example, Kristen Crook, she got over her shyness in her career, and people saw that as amazing and really looked up to that. So I don't think it never happened. Like, good things did happen, but I don't think it's attributable to Keith Raniere's special technology. I think it's attributable to, women who loved each other, sort of coming together and helping each other. So, yeah, but very little good, I would say, overall.
I mean, let's talk about the fact that it's primarily women in the inner circle. It's primarily women that have been manipulated and branded and psychologically tortured. So they're, the victims of the machine, but they're also the ones keeping the machine going. Why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, that was a hard one to get my brain around too. You have to understand that the women who are in the inner circle, who are doing the enforcing and doing all these really awful, frankly, things to each other, they can't think about leaving the group or going against Raniere's controls without thinking about completely destroying their life as they know it. So if they even go against, a tiny recommendation, they're going to get intense feedback. They might get the quote unquote wolf pack. So just like the group of enforcers after them, trying to get them back in line, just intense kinds of backlash, even just for, expressing concern or criticism. Or they could leave entirely and have almost no hope or purpose. It's just this very black and white mentality, life or death mentality, where, if they don't do exactly what Keith wants and get the exact outcome that Keith wants, then their life is destroyed. Like, they might not think that out loud. They probably internalized that to some degree, and they just think, they're doing the right thing, the ethical thing. But yeah, that's the mentality that allows sort of the women to then go on to hurt other women.
And he's so deeply misogynistic. It's hard to imagine that none of the women were like, this doesn't sound right.
Yeah, it doesn't pass like a regular person's sniff test. But it was introduced in ways that sounded kind of progressive. So it was like exposing, what people aren't saying but are thinking, and maybe if we expose ourselves to what's just beneath the surface, we can overcome it, we can evolve it, was sort of the thinking. And so that got many like progressive, vegan, feminist women of Vancouver, bike riders, just all the stereotypes, to get in a room and hear these things like, oh, women, they're prone to tantrums, they're protected from the world, and men always end up cleaning up all their problems. that's just sort of the way it is. And thinking of it as like, yeah, this is like the hard truths that we just haven't been able to face and what we need to overcome. So it sounds totally upside down. But there was, yeah, again, just a string that got people there.
And so you mentioned it, obviously there were people that you knew, acquaintances of acquaintances, and me too, actually, it turns out everyone knows Nicki Clyne in Vancouver, I guess. And the Vancouver Center, even though, this all started in New York, the Vancouver Center thrived. Why do you think that is? Obviously, you're from the West Coast. You have a unique insight into that mentality. Why do you think the people in Vancouver gravitated towards this in such a particular and strong way?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if she'd like me crediting her, but I do think Sarah Edmondson's hustle is essentially what made that happen. She was a true believer. She really did think it was, the key to success and happiness. And she was trying to get every one of her actor friends sort of through the group. So yeah, I would say the initial seed, I talk about it in the book, is her Artist's Way group. So I don't know if you know Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. It's this.
I do, yes, of course.
Artist book. And she had a group that got together. They were, women at a certain level in their career, and they wanted to level up and do creative things. And half of that group really went hard into NXIVM. And then the other half was like, oh, that sounds kind of culty. I don't know if I really want that. But because NXIVM is just a recruiting machine, that is what started to spread through Vancouver actors. If you listen to, one of the Smallville actors now has a podcast. And so he's chatted with a bunch of them now about how they got pitched on set. It really did just sort of go through this grapevine. And of course, actors and actresses, they're in an insecure and vulnerable place, right? Like they're waiting for people to notice them. They want something tangible, some graded series of things they can do to sort of get better. And this was what filled that gap. And I think in LA, maybe people are already into their sort of self-help program, their lifestyle. Maybe they're already into Scientology, or they know Scientology.
Yeah.
And they know to look the other way. But Vancouver's actors didn't have the same exposure to those things. So I think that's why those are the factors that really made it a thing here.
And I know that you've written about cults or groups like this before. A lot of the people seem to me like bored white people, and who obviously also have the means to not do anything and not, they can sort of seemingly go without regular jobs or just work enough to dedicate all their time to a cult. What's going on with the bored white people industrial complex? It's just driving cult membership.
I love this question. Yeah, I mean, you do have to be at a pretty privileged place in your life to be so caught up in meaning and purpose, right? If you're working on a survival level and are, encountering oppression in your day-to-day life, this kind of thing is maybe not speaking to you. And certainly a lot of people of color, Sarah Edmondson told me, came to the classes or maybe even just the open house, felt the vibe was weird, and left quietly.
Sounds right.
Because why would you sign up for suffering, essentially? If you are someone who experiences oppression and racism, it's not going to sound right to you, is sort of the takeaway that I started to come to. I did hear that, they were seeking representation in NXIVM. So they were trying to recruit people of color into NXIVM. and we're not really having any luck because it's mostly women and it's mostly white or white passing. There was a lot of really aristocratic, white passing Mexican folks.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think because of societal forces, like we're not as interested in organized religion, we're not as interested in regular sort of power structures. There is this sort of gap of meaning, and people are trying to make meaning. And if you have the most time and the most freedom, you're going to potentially, I mean, it's definitely not for every white woman, but you're going to find something that you think is getting you there. And suffering, is this thing. You're like, if you've got this white savior guilt, you want to suffer too. It's those are sort of the dynamics that at least I've come across. Certainly there are cults that have different demographics, but certainly the ones that are in the media, that are in our HBO feeds, they're the white women industrial complex ones.
Mm-hmm. And, given your work on Bountiful, were there similarities between, like, are there certain markers where you're like, okay, I see a pattern in not just who is drawn to these, but how they manipulate people and keep them there?
Totally. Yeah. So I recently actually went back into Bountiful research, not actually back to the physical place, but I definitely started to pick up on some of the similar dynamics. So, for example, just a culture of confession, just snitching. They're all snitching on each other in NXIVM, and they're all snitching on each other in Bountiful. So if someone's doing something against the leader's wishes, that's getting reported back and that's getting dealt with. Also, just like thought-stopping cliches. So if ever somebody is questioning, there's an immediate sort of almost, I don't know, aphorism answer that like kind of doesn't make sense, but it stops, it intervenes in the thoughts. Things like that. Just the making a human person into a deity, that's a real like obvious red flag. Like, why are you exalting someone who's just a human person and is flawed? And is there an accountability structure? So some organized religions, I mean, there's lots of abuses there too, but they at least have some kind of accountability structure. And groups like Bountiful and NXIVM just didn't.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the people in the group who stuck by Keith and maintain, despite all of the clear evidence to the contrary, that he's still a good person?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really challenging thing to sort of try and seek out their views because they are part of the story and they do have beliefs backing what they're doing. Yeah, and it was scary also to then learn also that they were lying on behalf of the group. So they had lied, for example, to the New York Times about whose idea was it to do the branding. So as a reporter, that's a huge red flag on credibility. I'm just like, I'm scared. Like, I don't want to quote someone who's going to potentially lie or discredit me. So that was a lot, that took up a lot of my thinking. But in terms of what keeps them, I do think it's sort of what I was talking about before, where it's almost the path of least resistance to stay loyal. Because if they think about leaving, they have to think about throwing away everything that's been meaningful to them for the last decade or more. They have to think about potentially destroying their relationships that they have maintained with these women that they're still friends with. And they have to admit they're wrong. And that might just not be where they're at yet. So I don't fault them for still having those beliefs. I do try and separate beliefs from actions, you know, and some of their actions are pretty scary too. But I do try to just sort of think of it as, actually, I draw a comparison to gay conversion therapy. So like some ex-gay people are happy and like think that it's great that they're no longer homosexual, right? But we as a society have been like, no, gay conversion therapy is wrong. You know, like, don't do that to a person because it's, you know, it violates basic human rights. So just because there's somebody at the end of it who might say, yes, I'm ex-gay, I got rid of my, you know, what made me gay, doesn't mean it's not overall wrong. And I think that's the case in NXIVM too. Just because there's somebody who went through this gauntlet, is probably dealing with trauma, whether they acknowledge it or not. Just because they think nothing was done to me, I'm not a victim, doesn't mean the overall system is not wrong.
Do you think there's anyone that got off too easy? I mean, parts of me think that even Sarah Edmondson got off a little too easy, but is there anyone that you sort of feel like, well, maybe the spotlight should have been on them a little bit more?
That's a very interesting question. I do think there's been a lot of, I mean, these 8 women who are founding members of DOS who did know that Keith Raniere was at the top of it and created it. I do think that there is accountability there that has yet to happen. So that would include Nicki Clyne. She hasn't been charged with any crime, but also some other Mexican members. I think that there is a space there to sort of go on the record and see what they think, and see if they ever come to a place where they understand what's happened to them and what they've done. But the problem is there's just so much, I don't know, healing and understanding that would need to happen first. So a lot of people are still kind of in very early in a healing journey, or maybe even haven't started that. So it's hard to get someone to acknowledge anything like that if they just haven't even engaged with it yet. But yeah, in terms of charges, I don't know. Like, I don't love to cheer for cops to arrest people. That's not something I really want to get into. But yeah, I do think there's certainly more to uncover.
Why do you think so much of the mainstream press, and certainly the sort of dramatizations that made it to film, don't deal with what happened in Mexico? It feels like such a purposely left out part of the story, but obviously from your book, it's such a huge and in many ways the most reprehensible part of what Keith did. Are you surprised that that's sort of been left out of the narrative about NXIVM?
Yeah, I do think that is kind of a shame. I do think that because there's this regular sort of attention structure that does gravitate towards wealthy white women, that there has been a lot left out. I mean, part of it is these women who did testify, who are from Mexico, their identities are protected. And to an extent, I, fully support that, that they would be able to hold on to their privacy, especially because one of them was a child victim of sexual abuse. So I do think there are some not good reasons why that's been left out and some good reasons why it's been left out. But yeah, with this book, I did want to really uncover what that perspective was like, because their undocumented status in the United States was one of the big levers that led to them being exploited worse than a lot of the other women who were involved. So yeah, I do think that's still kind of underexposed at this point.
Yeah, I definitely. And it's so it is the stuff that really kind of sticks with you. Given how much time you spent in court and how much, you know, this story has occupied of your mental space, is there one thing that you just kind of can't erase that still kind of sits with you or keeps you up?
God. Yeah, I would have to say, so Camilla, who was the victim of child sexual abuse, her texts were read in court. And so you had this FBI agent reading her texts, and then you had the prosecutor reading Keith Raniere's texts. And yeah, I think that just was another moment where everything sort of went blurry, and I sort of felt sort of sick just knowing how he talked to her and what just how everything was all about him. Like there just wasn't ever anything there other than him appeasing himself. It just, for whatever reason, it wasn't describing crimes or anything. It was just knowing the way he talked to this woman, who he kept in a home separate from everybody else. Even her parents and friends didn't know where she was located, right? Basically hiding an undocumented person behind these huge velvet curtains, which we also saw images of. Just really just was too much, like just on a human personal level. How could you do that to a human person? It still sort of rattles me. If I get into it too much, I feel upset.
Before we move on to the audience questions, and if you still have a question and you're watching, please make sure to get it in. I need to know about the volleyball.
I have not played volleyball since. I have to say it's ruined volleyball for me entirely. It was late nights. It definitely isn't like just a pickup game. Keith Raniere's at the center. He has just his regular dude competitors on the court with him. It was actually very hard for women to play with the dudes. It was really weird. They had to play on the amateur side of the court. He was smelly from all accounts. And then the women are just screaming every time he connects with the ball. So yeah, just having that described in various ways to me over the years has completely ruined volleyball for me.
I feel it's like ruining it for me right now. Just that description alone is horrifying. Oh my God. It's ick. Okay, I'm just going to move to some audience questions now. This is a good one. And actually, I was going to ask about this. So I'm glad someone did. But NXIVM seems to have a strong anti-fat bias, both by virtue of the recruits' appearances, but also, of course, you know, all the sort of techniques that he uses to control people are reminiscent of eating disorders and disordered eating and sort of classic control techniques. So has that sort of cult of thinness come up in the aftermath? Andrea Warner wants to know.
Oh, thanks for that question, Andrea. I mean, yeah, so definitely in the self-help industry, you know, fat phobia is an easy vulnerability to sort of get people in the door. And I think definitely NXIVM took advantage of that. So on the course materials, people are listing literally everything that makes them uncomfortable, you know, all their insecurities. They're just handing it over as like, you know, to be used as tools against them. And for women, this is, you know, one of the things. And, you know, we hopefully can just interrogate that and realize that it comes from a really misogynist, fat phobic place and sort of, you know, deal with it on that level. But that's not what happened in NXIVM. In NXIVM, it was like, well, this is fixable. You can just completely cut all your calories for the day. And if you don't do it, that means you are not committed enough to your goal. So this became sort of a trap for people. yeah, I do see connections to it everywhere. I think there's always these, cleanses and online programs that sort of give me NXIVM vibes. And yeah, I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, Andrea, but definitely that was something used as a tool, and yeah, frankly, got so many people into a really dark place.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that it was the women keeping each other in line about that as well. That it's, it's not just coming from Keith, that it's coming from the other women who are monitoring each other's bodies in that way.
Totally. Yeah, there was so much reinforcement just built into the community. And yeah, you also in DOS couldn't eat without asking permission. So you're just getting into a real insane kind of place.
Here is a question from Daniel and Darian. Same question. Was it surprising to you to see the amount of digital evidence that was presented in court? And basically, any thoughts on why they didn't try to conceal any of it, or why they didn't delete more of it?
Yeah, I think this is where Keith Raniere's arrogance kind of comes in. He thought that his ideas of the world were fine, and they had all these recordings of them discussing branding and discussing sort of all these elements of the case. He didn't think that it would come to that he could even be charged with these things as crimes, because he had planned to have people on camera saying, "Master, please brand me. It would be an honor." He literally tried to build in consent, or the appearance of consent, into the entire program. So I think that does come from a place of feeling untouchable for 30, 40 years before this. It's like he got so ambitious. He wasn't investigated for so long. He could pay off politicians for so long that it just got to a place where, yeah, there's so much evidence, so much digital record of what he was thinking and doing, that it made it a pretty, unbelievable case to listen to in court.
And good for the book.
It's pretty good for that too, yeah.
As a writer, how difficult is it to translate NXIVM speak and make it legible? Obviously, there's words like ethics that have been distorted and changed to mean whatever Keith Raniere wants it to mean. So did you feel kind of bogged down by some of that exposition that you felt needed to be done?
Absolutely. Yes. I got so mad at NXIVM Speak. There was a draft where I just threw it all out, and my editor was like, "No, you have to a little bit." But yeah, because it was so meaningful to the in-group and completely meaningless for people outside, that was almost the point, to get this language and meaning only happening within the group, so that they could have this sort of insidery feeling happening. But yeah, I did try to explain some of it. Definitely the stuff that really got people in the door and really did keep them in place, I felt like had to be covered. And this issue of being a victim, I feel like, is something that everybody kind of deals with on some level. So anything that had something universal to say, I tried to explain fully, but yeah, tried to keep it definitely out of the like chapter titles. I'm like not gonna make somebody know NXIVM Speak to understand my book. That just feels rude.
Do you think that the wide publicity and fallout of this will make it harder for something like this to happen in the future?
That's not something I really thought about. I definitely think, our cult's obsession has been going on for years now, like just in popular culture in general. I think people do have a lot more knowledge about the dynamics and about the sort of red flags that people can catch. I do think there's way more understanding to go. I think the comparisons in this trial between a coercive control situation in a cult and a coercive control situation in a domestic relationship can be bridged further. So yeah, most of these kinds of situations happen in one-on-one or sort of family dynamics. It looks a little different in a cult, and then you do have the sort of weird beliefs that go with it. But I think there could definitely be more understanding. I do hope, though, that this book and other books like it do contribute a little bit to some understanding there. But there's definitely no shortage of cults. I'm still reporting on a few of them. So,
like what?
Like Twin Flames universe is one that I've been following for a year now. I did a Vice story about it. It preaches that you find your twin flame, so your soulmate for all eternity, and their coaches get you to find your twin flame. And yeah, that's a weird one. If anybody wants some homework.
I'm going to go literally immediately after this call. I will be looking up Twin Flames universe.
Yeah, look them
up. Okay, someone wants to ask about the meeting with Frank Parlato, whose motives are a bit mixed and whose reporting perhaps tends toward the salacious. So what was that like?
Yeah, so Frank Parlato, I think people who have been following this group, some of them are really thankful for him, bringing this stuff to light. He was for a long time one of the only people kind of doing it. Most people, I feel, are begrudging about that. If you follow it, it's certainly got a certain bent. It's certainly not to a journalistic standard that some mainstream reporters would accept. But I mean, yeah, he has been there the whole way. He definitely had all the sources. He played a role in putting this on the radar of the New York Times. So you can't untangle it. You can't ignore his role in this story. And his role actually goes back a long time, to 2007. He was working for them in a PR capacity for a while. But yeah, definitely had shifty intentions even from the beginning. Like, he showed up at one of the property developments with two, a lawyer, like these actors, and, pretended to be working for Edgar Bronfman. So definitely another situation where it's like, how do I assess the credibility here? It's very, very hard. But yeah, I just had complicated feelings the whole time. That's how it went.
Mm-hmm. This is my question before we get to the last one here is, where was the money coming from? Like, obviously we know the Bronfmans, but I mean, he did this for so long. How without working?
Yeah, well, like, there were more heiresses than just the Bronfmans. Like, there were earlier heiresses like Pam Fritz, and there were Mexican heiresses that came sort of in the later stage who, yeah, again, made just huge, huge contributions. And then there is just the money generated by NXIVM. So nobody in the coaching level of things made any money almost ever. Even the people who had centers like Sarah Edmondson, they weren't making crazy money.
She was making money for sure, right?
He was definitely making money, yes. But they weren't sustainable. It was only, like, all the corporate money was just going to Albany, and who knows, what it was going towards. Maybe it was just, it was stuck in a shoebox in Nancy Salzman's basement, it seemed like. That's at least what the FBI found. But it's hard to understand where the money comes from, but it's also, since nobody else was making money, of course somebody at the middle had to. But yeah, it doesn't add up. I will say that.
I thought so. Okay, this is a question from Jen. In the movie adaptation of your book, who plays Keith and who plays you?
Oh no. Jen, Amil, that's a question for you. You
Okay.
would have the best answer.
I was gonna say, like, what about Steve Zahn to play Keith Raniere?
Okay.
Because he's already like, do you know who I'm talking about, Sarah?
No, I don't.
I knew it. Your reaction tells me that you don't, because if you knew, you'd be like, oh, of course, Steve
Of
Zahn.
course, Steve Zahn.
Absolutely should play Keith Raniere. While I'm just gonna quickly pop a photo.
I mean, yeah, let's Google.
And then I think to play you, oh my gosh, to play you, I'm picturing, oh my gosh. That's a tricky one, Sarah. Who do you think should play you?
Mila Kunis.
Yes, I like that. I think that's very good.
I think she would be really funny. She would definitely be funnier than me.
You're pretty funny, I think.
Oh.
Okay, I'm about to pop the Steve Zahn photo in here so that you can realize how very good that casting is.
Oh wow! Yes. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Amil, you're so right. Yes.
But what about giving Nicki Clyne the role of Sarah Berman?
You know, I would have to see the audition tape, right? We'll see.
That would be a full circle moment.
Yeah, Nicki, if you're listening, call me. We'll talk.
Sarah, thank you so much for this. And again, congratulations on this book. It really is. It's so, I think you just bring humanity to the stories of the people that kind of have been left out of the narrative. And you do it in a way that isn't salacious and kind of craven. And I feel like some of the treatments have been. And I hope that you can cleanse yourself of some of those things, because it's a lot. You have spent a lot of time with this story. Like I said, 5 years since, we first talked about it back at Vice. And that's a long time to sit with something like that. So
I think you're right. Yeah, I need to power wash my brain somehow. I'll work on that next. Thanks, Neil. This was so fun.
This was so fun. And what do you think? Sequel in the works?
No. If I do another book, it will be for sure another topic. Definitely
Okay.
not.
Yeah, you're done. Done with the NXIVM story.
For now, for sure.
Okay.
Right.
Well,
thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and make sure you buy the book.
Thanks, guys. Wahoo.